The morning of April 21st, 1918 began like any other for the pilots of Jagdgeschwader 1, Germany's most feared aerial squadron. Yet before the sun would set over the scarred battlefields of France, the war's greatest flying ace would lie dead in a foreign field. His bright red Fokker triplane a twisted monument to the brutal realities of aerial combat. Manfred Albrecht Freiherr von Richthofen, known to the world as the Red Baron, would fly his final mission that morning, chasing glory into the jaws of death. His last flight would become one of the most controversial and debated events in aviation history, a tale of courage, miscalculation, and the thin line between legend and mortality. The story of this final flight begins not on that fateful April morning, but years earlier in the grand estates of Prussia, where a young aristocrat would learn the skills that would make him both hunter and hunted. For to understand the magnitude of what was lost on April 21st, we must first understand who Manfred von Richthofen truly was, and how he became the most feared pilot in the skies over the Western Front. Born on May 2nd, 1892, in the Silesian city of Breslau, now known as Wrocław in modern Poland, Manfred Albrecht Freiherr von Richthofen entered the world during an age of change. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Europe. Steam was giving way to electricity, and the old certainties of aristocratic life were beginning to crack under the weight of progress. Yet in the von Richthofen household, tradition still held sway. His father, Major Albrecht Philipp Karl Julius Freiherr von Richthofen, embodied the Prussian military tradition. The family held an ancient title of nobility, the Freiherr designation meaning literally free lord, a title that all male members of the family bore, even during their father's lifetime. It was not merely a hereditary distinction, but a way of life, demanding service to the state, an unwavering dedication to duty. The von Richthofen estate sprawled across the fertile lands of Silesia, a world of hunting lodges, carefully tended forests, and vast fields where young Manfred learned his first lessons in the art of the hunt. Here, among the ancient oaks and morning mists, he developed the eye of a marksman and the patience of a predator. His childhood was spent tracking deer through dense woodlands, learning to read the wind, to anticipate the movements of his quarry, and to place his shots with deadly precision. These skills, learned in peaceful pursuit among the game preserves of Prussia, would prove invaluable in the killing fields above France. The steady hand that could drop a stag at 200 yards would soon guide machine gun bursts into the cockpits of Allied aircraft. The hunter's patience that allowed him to wait motionless for hours in a forest blind would serve him well when stalking prey through the vast blue arena of the sky. At age 11, following the traditions of his class, Manfred was sent to the military academy at Wahlstatt. The transition from the comfortable family estate to the rigid discipline of Prussian military education was jarring, but it forged in him the iron discipline that would characterize his approach to aerial combat. 8 years of military schooling instilled in him not just tactical knowledge, but an unshakable confidence in his own abilities and a deep understanding of command. The academy years were formative in ways beyond mere military instruction. Here, Manfred learned to suppress emotion in favor of calculated decision-making. He discovered that leadership was not about popularity, but about inspiring confidence through competence. Most importantly, he absorbed the Prussian military ethos that viewed warfare not as chaos, but as a science to be studied, mastered, and applied with methodical precision. In 1911, at age 19, Richthofen was commissioned as a lieutenant in the 1st Regiment of Uhlans, an elite cavalry unit named after Kaiser Alexander III. The Uhlans were the pride of the Prussian army, their distinctive lance and colourful uniforms harking back to an earlier age of warfare when honour and individual skill could decide the fate of battles. Young Lieutenant von Richthofen threw himself into cavalry life with enthusiasm. He excelled at horsemanship, becoming known for his fearless riding and his ability to control even the most spirited mounts. The cavalry taught him lessons that would prove invaluable in his later aerial career. He learned to think in 3 dimensions, to understand how speed and maneuverability could overcome superior numbers, and to appreciate the psychological impact of a sudden, devastating attack. The cavalry also reinforced his aristocratic worldview. War, to the mind of a Uhlan officer, was still largely a matter of individual skill and courage. A single charge, properly timed and executed with sufficient elan, could shatter an enemy line. This romantic notion of combat would follow Richthofen into the air, where he would discover that the age of knightly combat was not quite dead, merely transformed into a new arena among the clouds. When war erupted across Europe in August 1914, Lieutenant von Richthofen rode to battle filled with the same excitement that had animated Prussian officers for generations. The 1st Regiment of Uhlans was among the first units to cross into enemy territory, their lances glinting in the summer sun as they advanced into Belgium and France. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the old ways of warfare might yet prevail, but the Western Front quickly became a graveyard for cavalry tactics. The machine gun and modern artillery transformed the battlefield into a killing field, where horses and men alike fell in windows before they could close with the enemy. Cavalry charges, once the decisive factor in European warfare, became exercises in futility against entrenched positions, bristling with automatic weapons. Richthofen's first taste of modern combat came during the early mobile phase of the war, when German forces were still advancing rapidly through Belgium and northern France. The young cavalry officer distinguished himself in several skirmishes, earning the Iron Cross for courage under fire. But as the autumn of 1914 brought the war of movement to an end, he found himself increasingly assigned to mundane duties far from the fighting. The transformation of the Western Front into a continuous line of trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border rendered cavalry obsolete virtually overnight. Where once the Uhlans had been the eyes and sword arm of the German army, they now found themselves reduced to carrying messages, escorting supply convoys, and other rear echelon duties that offered little opportunity for glory or advancement. For an ambitious young officer from an ancient military family, this transition was deeply frustrating. Richthofen had not endured 8 years of military academy and intensive cavalry training to spend the war delivering dispatches behind the lines. He needed a new arena in which to prove himself, a new domain where individual skill and courage still mattered. That domain would prove to be the sky. The Great War marked the first conflict in which aircraft played a significant role, though their initial use was primarily for reconnaissance. These early flying machines were fragile contraptions of wood, wire, and fabric, barely capable of carrying a pilot and observer aloft for a few hours of observation. They were not yet weapons of war, but rather mechanical ravens, carrying word of enemy movements back to headquarters. As Richthofen watched these early aircraft droning overhead, he began to see possibilities that escaped others. Here was a form of warfare that still depended heavily on individual skill and courage. A pilot was master of his own fate in a way that a frontline soldier, huddled in a trench and subject to the random violence of artillery, could never be. Aviation offered the possibility of personal combat in an increasingly impersonal war. In 1915, after months of lobbying his superiors, Richthofen finally secured a transfer to the Imperial German Air Service, known as the Luftstreitkräfte. He was initially assigned as an observer rather than a pilot, tasked with flying reconnaissance missions over enemy lines while someone else handled the controls. This arrangement did not suit his temperament, but it gave him his first taste of aerial warfare and convinced him that his future lay in the sky. The training process for military aviators in 1915 was rudimentary by later standards. Pilots received perhaps 30 hours of instruction before being considered ready for combat operations. Safety was a secondary concern to rapid deployment, and casualties during training were appallingly high. Many promising airmen died learning to fly, victims of mechanical failure, inexperience, or simple bad luck. Richthofen approached flight training with the same methodical determination he had applied to his cavalry skills. He studied every aspect of aircraft operation, from engine mechanics to the effects of weather on flight performance. While other students relied on instinct and hoped for the best, he systematically learned to read the sky like a hunter reads a forest, understanding how altitude, wind direction, and atmospheric conditions affected both his own aircraft and those of potential enemies. His first combat assignment came in the summer of 1915, flying reconnaissance missions over the Eastern Front in Russia. These early flights were relatively peaceful affairs, as neither side had yet developed effective fighter aircraft or anti-aircraft defenses. Richthofen's job was simply to observe and report, photographing enemy positions and troop movements from altitudes that were supposed to keep him safe from ground fire. But even during these routine missions, Richthofen was learning lessons that would serve him well in the more lethal skies of the Western Front. He discovered that altitude was the key to survival, that the pilot who could climb highest and fastest held the decisive advantage in any engagement. He learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of enemy aircraft, and to use cloud cover and sun angles to mask his own approach. Most importantly, he began to understand the psychology of aerial combat. Unlike ground warfare, where soldiers could take cover and wait for danger to pass, aerial combat was intensely personal. When two aircraft met in the sky, there was nowhere to hide, no possibility of retreat or surrender. One pilot would live, and the other would die. This stark reality appealed to something deep in Richthofen's aristocratic nature, a yearning for the clean, honest combat of an earlier age. After several months on the Eastern Front, Richthofen was transferred back to the West, where the aerial war was becoming increasingly sophisticated and deadly. The primitive reconnaissance aircraft of 1914 were giving way to purpose-built fighters, armed with synchronized machine guns that could fire through the propeller arc. These new weapons transformed aviation from a support role into a combat arm in its own right. It was during this period that Richthofen met the man who would become his mentor and the architect of his tactical philosophy, Hauptmann Oswald Boelcke. Boelcke was already a legendary figure in German aviation, one of the first true fighter aces and a tactical innovator whose ideas about aerial combat would influence an entire generation of pilots. Boelcke had codified his observations about air fighting into a set of principles known as the Dicta Boelcke. These rules emphasized the importance of altitude advantage, the element of surprise, and the concentration of force at the decisive point. They stressed the need for aggressive tactics, but tempered with caution and careful observation. Most importantly, they treated aerial combat as a science rather than an art, something that could be studied, practiced, and perfected. Under Boelcke's tutelage, Richthofen learned to see aerial combat not as a chaotic melee, but as a calculated endeavor where preparation and technique counted for more than raw courage. Boelcke taught him to study his opponents, to learn their habits and preferences, and to exploit their weaknesses. He emphasized the importance of teamwork, showing how a group of fighters working in coordination could defeat superior numbers of individual opponents. Richthofen's first confirmed victory came on September 17, 1916, when he shot down a British aircraft over the Somme battlefield. The engagement was brief and violent, lasting perhaps 2 minutes from first contact to the moment when the enemy machine plummeted earthward in flames. But those 2 minutes represented years of preparation and training, the culmination of everything he had learned about flying, shooting, and the deadly art of aerial combat. The kill came exactly as Boelcke had taught him. Richthofen had positioned himself above and behind his target, using the sun to mask his approach. He waited until he was close enough to be certain of his aim before opening fire, and he continued shooting until the enemy aircraft was clearly destroyed. There was nothing sporting or chivalrous about the engagement. It was simply professional execution of superior tactics and training. That first victory marked the beginning of Richthofen's transformation from a competent pilot into a legendary ace. Over the following months, his score climbed steadily as he refined his techniques and gained experience. By early 1917, he had claimed 16 enemy aircraft, making him one of Germany's leading aces. More importantly, his success was not the result of reckless bravery, but of careful planning and methodical execution. Richthofen's approach to aerial combat was fundamentally different from many of his contemporaries. While other pilots relied on intuition and reflexes, he studied his profession with the same intensity he had once devoted to hunting. He kept detailed records of every engagement, noting the types of aircraft involved, the tactics employed, and the factors that led to success or failure. He studied captured enemy aircraft to understand their capabilities and limitations. This methodical approach extended to every aspect of his flying career. He personally selected and tested his aircraft, ensuring that each machine was tuned to perfection. He worked closely with his mechanics to understand every bolt and wire of his fighters, knowing that mechanical failure in combat usually meant death. He practiced his gunnery skills constantly, learning to judge range and deflection angles instinctively. Most unusually for a fighter pilot, Richthofen was also a gifted leader and organizer. As his reputation grew, he was given command of first a flight, then a squadron. Unlike many aces who preferred to hunt alone, Richthofen understood the value of coordinated tactics. He trained his pilots to work as a team, with each member of the formation playing a specific role in the overall plan of attack. In January 1917, Richthofen was appointed commander of Jagdstaffel 11, one of the most elite fighter squadrons in the German air service. Under his leadership, the unit became a finishing school for aces, producing more successful pilots than any other squadron in the German military. Richthofen's method was to lead by example, demonstrating proper tactics through his own flying, while gradually allowing his subordinates to take on greater responsibilities. The spring of 1917 marked the peak of Richthofen's individual success as a fighter pilot. During the month of April alone, he shot down 22 British aircraft, a staggering achievement that earned him lasting fame and the nickname Bloody April among Allied airmen. His red-painted aircraft became a symbol of death in the skies over the Western Front, and Allied pilots spoke his name with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. But Richthofen was not content with personal success. He understood that the war would not be won by individual aces, no matter how skilled, but by the systematic application of air power in support of ground operations. In June 1917, he was given command of a larger formation, Jagdgeschwader 1, the first of Germany's multi-squadron fighter wings. Jagdgeschwader 1 was an experimental organization, combining 4 fighter squadrons under a single commander and giving them unprecedented mobility and striking power. The formation was designed to concentrate Germany's best pilots and aircraft wherever they were most needed, moving rapidly from one sector of the front to another as tactical situations demanded. This mobility, combined with the colorful paint schemes favored by many of the pilots, earned the unit the nickname the Flying Circus. The Flying Circus represented the culmination of everything Richthofen had learned about aerial warfare. It combined the individual skills of elite pilots with the tactical flexibility of a mobile strike force. Under his command, the unit became the most feared aerial formation of the war, capable of achieving local air superiority wherever it operated. The mere rumor that Richthofen's circus was operating in a sector was enough to cause Allied commanders to cancel planned air operations. Leading the Flying Circus required Richthofen to develop new skills beyond those of a simple fighter pilot. He had to coordinate with ground forces, manage logistics, and balance the competing demands of different squadrons within his command. He had to maintain the morale and fighting spirit of nearly 50 pilots, many of them aces in their own right, with strong personalities and definite opinions about how the war should be fought. Perhaps most challengingly, he had to manage his own growing fame. By 1917, Richthofen was the most famous German soldier after the Kaiser himself. His exploits were front-page news in German newspapers, and his autobiography, Der Rote Kampfflieger, the Red Fighter Pilot, became a bestseller. This celebrity status brought both advantages and disadvantages. It helped with recruiting and morale, but it also made him a marked man, a prize target for every Allied pilot who dreamed of fame. The pressure of command and celebrity began to show in Richthofen's flying, where once he had been cautious and methodical, he began to take greater risks, perhaps feeling the need to maintain his reputation through increasingly spectacular victories. His tactics became more aggressive, and he began to engage in combat situations that he would have avoided earlier in his career. In July 1917, this new aggressiveness nearly cost him his life. During a mission over Belgium, Richthofen was attacked by a flight of British fighters led by Captain Donald Cunnell. In the ensuing dogfight, a bullet creased his skull, causing a severe head wound that left him temporarily blinded and forced him to make an emergency landing behind German lines. The wound was more serious than initially believed. Modern medical analysis suggests that Richthofen suffered a skull fracture that would have caused persistent headaches, vision problems, and possibly changes in personality and judgment. The injury required months of convalescence, during which time he was promoted to Rittmeister, cavalry captain, and awarded numerous decorations, including the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor. When Richthofen returned to active duty in the autumn of 1917, those close to him noticed changes in his demeanor. The cold, calculating hunter of earlier years had been replaced by a more volatile personality, prone to sudden bursts of anger and increasingly willing to take unnecessary risks. Some historians have suggested that his head wound may have affected his judgment, making him more impulsive and less careful about assessing tactical situations. The winter of 1917 to 1918 was relatively quiet on the Western Front, as both sides prepared for what everyone knew would be decisive campaigns in the coming year. Germany was running out of time. The entry of the United States into the war meant that fresh troops and unlimited resources were flowing to the Allies, while Germany was increasingly exhausted by 3 years of total warfare. For the Luftstreitkräfte, the situation was particularly grim. Although German aircraft design had kept pace with Allied developments, production was falling behind due to material shortages and bombing of aircraft factories. More critically, the loss of experienced pilots was accelerating. Where once it had taken years to train a competent fighter pilot, new recruits were now being rushed to the front with minimal preparation, only to be shot down within days of their arrival. Richthofen was acutely aware of these deteriorating conditions. His diary entries from this period reflect a growing pessimism about Germany's chances of victory. He wrote frequently about the loss of old comrades and the poor quality of replacement pilots. Most tellingly, he began to speak about his own death as an inevitable occurrence, expressing doubt that he would survive the war. Despite these concerns, Richthofen continued to fly and fight with undiminished skill. His score continued to climb, though more slowly than in the glory days of 1917. Each new victory required greater effort and risk, as Allied pilots had learned to respect his reputation and avoid the obvious tactical mistakes that had cost so many lives in earlier years. The spring of 1918 brought Germany's last great offensive on the Western Front. Operation Michael, launched on March 21st, represented Germany's final attempt to win the war before American reinforcements could tip the balance irrevocably in favor of the Allies. For the Luftstreitkräfte, this meant maximum effort in support of the ground offensive, with every available aircraft committed to the battle. Jagdgeschwader 1 was moved to Kappy, near the Somme River, where it could provide close support for the advancing German troops. The airfield was little more than a grass strip with canvas hangars and tent accommodations for the pilots. Living conditions were primitive, but the location put the flying circus within easy striking distance of the most important sector of the offensive. The early days of Operation Michael were remarkably successful for German forces. The careful planning and innovative tactics employed by the German army caught the Allies completely off guard, and entire divisions of British troops found themselves surrounded and forced to surrender. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the old dream of decisive victory might yet be realized, but the offensive was ultimately unsustainable. Germany lacked the reserves to exploit its initial successes, and the advancing troops quickly outran their supply lines. By April, the offensive had stalled, and Allied counterattacks were beginning to push German forces back toward their starting positions. The window of opportunity was closing, and everyone knew it. For Richthofen and his pilots, this meant flying increasingly dangerous missions in support of troops who were fighting for their lives. The tactical situation demanded close support sorties at low altitude, exactly the kind of missions that exposed aircraft to ground fire and made escape difficult if something went wrong. The days of high-altitude dueling between individual aces were largely over. The war had become a desperate struggle for survival. On April 20th, 1918, Richthofen scored his 80th and final confirmed victory, shooting down a British aircraft over the Somme battlefield. It was a routine engagement by the standards of the time, lasting only a few minutes and concluded with the enemy machine crashing behind German lines. There was nothing to suggest that this victory would be his last, or that he had less than 24 hours to live. That evening, Richthofen wrote in his diary with unusual introspection. He spoke of being tired, not just physically, but emotionally drained by years of constant combat. He mentioned the deaths of so many friends and comrades, and wondered aloud whether any of them would live to see the end of the war. Most poignantly, he wrote about his desire to return home to the family estate, to hunt in the forests of his youth, where the only danger came from wild boar rather than machine guns. The morning of April 21st dawned clear and bright over the Somme Valley. Weather conditions were perfect for flying with unlimited visibility and light winds. For the pilots of both sides, it promised to be a busy day, with multiple missions planned in support of the ongoing ground operations. Richthofen rose early, as was his custom, and spent time reviewing the tactical situation with his squadron commanders. Intelligence reports indicated that British forces were planning a major push in the sector, which meant that Allied reconnaissance aircraft would be active throughout the day. It was exactly the kind of target-rich environment that the flying circus was designed to exploit. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, Richthofen led a formation of Fokker-Dockerai triplanes into the air from the field at Kappy. The formation consisted of aircraft from Jagdstaffel 11, Richthofen's old squadron, now commanded by his younger brother Lothar. Also flying with the formation was Lieutenant Wolfram von Richthofen, the Baron's cousin, who had recently joined the squadron after completing his training. The mission was a standard fighter sweep, designed to clear British aircraft from the skies over the Somme and protect German ground forces from air attack. Richthofen's formation climbed to approximately 12,000 feet, an altitude that would give them a tactical advantage over any Allied aircraft they might encounter at lower levels. Meanwhile, on the other side of the lines, No. 209 Squadron of the Royal Air Force was preparing for its own morning patrol. The squadron was equipped with Sopwith Camel fighters, single-seat aircraft that were highly maneuverable but difficult to fly. The Camel was notorious for its tricky handling characteristics, particularly during takeoff and landing, but in the hands of an experienced pilot, it was a formidable opponent. Leading the British formation was Captain Arthur Roy Brown, a seasoned pilot with 10 confirmed victories to his credit. Brown was known for his aggressive flying style and his devotion to the safety of his pilots. Flying with him that morning was his old school friend, Second Lieutenant Wilfred Reed May, universally known as WOP to his comrades. May was on only his second combat mission, having arrived at the squadron just days earlier after completing his training in England. Brown had specifically instructed May to stay out of any fighting and to observe how more experienced pilots conducted themselves in combat. It was standard procedure for new pilots, designed to give them a chance to learn the ropes before being thrown into the deadly game of aerial combat. The two formations were heading toward each other on what appeared to be a collision course, though neither side was initially aware of the other's presence. The morning sun was behind the German formation, giving them a significant tactical advantage, while the British aircraft were silhouetted against the lighter eastern sky. At approximately 11 o'clock, the two formations spotted each other simultaneously. Both sides immediately began maneuvering for advantage, climbing and turning to gain the most favorable position for attack. What followed was a classic example of the kind of large-scale aerial combat that had become common in the final year of the war. Brown's formation found itself at a significant disadvantage, both in terms of numbers and position. Richthofen's pilots had the altitude advantage and the sun behind them, two of the most important tactical factors in aerial combat. Under normal circumstances, the British formation would have been well advised to break off and seek more favorable conditions for engagement, but the tactical situation on the ground made withdrawal impossible. British infantry was advancing below, and they needed air cover to protect them from German ground attack aircraft. Brown's formation had no choice but to engage, despite the unfavorable odds. The initial clash was brief but violent. Both formations dove toward each other, machine guns chattering as pilots tried to line up killing shots in the few seconds available. Aircraft twisted and turned in impossible maneuvers, pulling G-forces that strained both men and machines to their limits. Several pilots fired long bursts without effect, the range too great and the deflection angles too difficult to judge accurately. In the swirling chaos of the dogfight, young Wat May forgot his instructions and joined the battle. He spotted what he thought was an easy target and dove to attack, firing a burst at one of the German aircraft. His target was Wolfram von Richthofen, Manfred's cousin, who was indeed inexperienced and therefore vulnerable to attack. Manfred von Richthofen, flying at the head of his formation, saw his cousin under attack and immediately reacted. Banking his red triplane into a steep diving turn, he moved to intercept May's camel before the Canadian could complete his attack. It was exactly the kind of protective maneuver that had made Richthofen such an effective leader, placing himself at risk to protect a subordinate. May, suddenly finding himself under attack by the most dangerous pilot in the German Air Force, made the only sensible decision available to him. He pushed his camel into a steep dive and fled toward the British lines, hoping to reach the safety of Allied anti-aircraft guns before Richthofen could close the distance and deliver a killing burst. What happened next would be debated for decades. Richthofen, instead of breaking off the pursuit as tactical doctrine demanded, followed May down in a long, shallow dive that took both aircraft far behind British lines. This was exactly the kind of mistake that Richthofen had warned his own pilots against, the cardinal sin of allowing bloodlust to overcome tactical judgment. Several factors may have contributed to Richthofen's uncharacteristic decision to pursue a single enemy aircraft so far into hostile territory. His head wound from the previous year may have affected his judgment, making him more impulsive and less careful about assessing risks. The stress of continuous combat and the mounting losses among his pilots may have worn down his usual caution. It's also possible that Richthofen saw in May's flight an opportunity for an easy victory that would boost morale among his increasingly demoralized pilots. An 81st kill would be a significant milestone, and the propaganda value of such an achievement would be considerable. Unfortunately, the pursuit of this seemingly easy target would prove to be his undoing. Captain Brown, observing May's desperate flight and Richthofen's pursuit, immediately moved to intervene. Diving steeply to build up speed, he positioned his camel behind and above the red triplane, using the same tactics that Richthofen himself had employed so successfully against countless Allied pilots. The chase had now taken all three aircraft down to extremely low altitude, perhaps 200 feet above the ground. At this height, any mistake would be instantly fatal, and the slightest mechanical failure would leave no time for recovery. Both Richthofen and May were flying at the very edge of their aircraft's performance envelope, their engines straining and their control surfaces shuddering under the stress of violent maneuvering. Brown's intervention caught Richthofen by surprise. Focused intently on May's aircraft, he may not have seen the camel diving on him from above until it was too late to take effective evasive action. Brown fired a long burst at close range, his bullets stitching along the length of the red triplane's fuselage. The exact sequence of events in the next few seconds remains controversial to this day. What is certain is that Richthofen's aircraft was hit by gunfire, that he was wounded, and that his triplane made a forced landing in a field near the village of Vaux-sur-Somme. What remains uncertain is who fired the fatal shot, and exactly how Manfred von Richthofen died. Captain Brown's combat report claimed credit for the victory, stating that he had fired a burst at the red triplane and observed it crash land shortly afterward. Brown's version of events was accepted by RAF headquarters, and he was officially credited with shooting down the famous Red Baron. For his achievement, he was awarded a bar to his Distinguished Service Cross and became an instant celebrity. But Brown's account was immediately challenged by Australian ground forces, who claimed to have been firing at Richthofen's aircraft as it flew over their positions. Multiple witnesses, including Sergeant Cedric Popkin of the 24th Australian Machine Gun Company, claimed to have hit the red triplane with ground fire just before it crash-landed. The controversy deepened when Richthofen's body was examined by Allied medical personnel. The autopsy revealed that he had been killed by a single bullet wound to the chest, but the angle and trajectory of the bullet suggested that it had been fired from below rather than from behind. This finding seemed to support the claims of the Australian ground troops, rather than Brown's account of an aerial engagement. Modern forensic analysis has only added to the confusion. Different experts have reached different conclusions based on the available evidence, with some supporting Brown's claim and others favouring the ground fire theory. The truth is that the combat was so brief and chaotic that no single witness had a complete view of what happened, and the physical evidence is ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations. What is beyond dispute is that Manfred von Richthofen was mortally wounded during the engagement, and that his aircraft made a controlled landing in a field approximately 2 miles behind British lines. Australian infantrymen reached the crash site within minutes and found Richthofen slumped in his cockpit, bleeding from a chest wound but still alive. According to several eyewitness accounts, Richthofen remained conscious for a few moments after the crash. Some witnesses claimed that he spoke a single word, kaput, before losing consciousness and dying shortly afterward. Others reported that he was already unconscious when they reached the aircraft and died without regaining awareness. The scene around the crash site quickly became chaotic as soldiers and officers gathered to view the body of Germany's most famous pilot. Souvenir hunters began dismantling the aircraft even before Richthofen's body had been removed, stripping away pieces of fabric, instruments, and fittings. Within hours, little remained of the red triplane except the basic framework. Major David Blake, commanding officer of No. 3 Squadron, Australian Flying Corps, took responsibility for Richthofen's remains and organised a military funeral befitting a respected enemy. Despite the bitter nature of the ongoing war, Blake and his men treated the dead German ace with considerable honour, recognising his skill and courage even though he had been their enemy. The funeral was held on April 22nd at the village cemetery in Bertangle, near Amiens. 6 officers from the Australian Flying Corps served as pallbearers, and a guard of honour fired a salute over the grave. Allied aircraft dropped wreaths from the air, and several senior British officers attended the ceremony. The Times of London later described it as a simple but impressive ceremony, conducted with full military honours. The death of the Red Baron sent shockwaves through both the German and Allied air forces. For the Germans, it represented the loss of their greatest aerial hero at a time when morale was already fragile. Richthofen's death seemed to symbolise the changing fortunes of the war, the gradual but inexorable shift in momentum that would ultimately lead to Germany's defeat. For the Allies, Richthofen's death was both a cause for celebration and a moment of somber reflection. While his removal from the battlefield eliminated a significant threat, it also marked the end of an era in aerial warfare. The days of individual aerial knights dueling in single combat were giving way to mass formations and coordinated tactics that left little room for personal heroism. The immediate impact on German aviation was severe. Jagdgeschwader 1, deprived of its charismatic leader, never again achieved the same level of success. Command of the unit passed first to Hauptmann Wilhelm Reinhard, who was killed in a flying accident just 3 months later, and then to Oberleutnant Hermann Göring, who would later achieve notoriety as head of the Luftwaffe in World War II. But the loss extended far beyond tactical considerations. Richthofen had been more than just a skilled pilot. He had been a symbol of German excellence and superiority in the air. His red aircraft had become synonymous with German air power, and his death suggested that even Germany's best could be defeated. The psychological impact on German pilots was enormous, contributing to a decline in morale that accelerated as the war moved toward its conclusion. The controversy surrounding Richthofen's death would persist long after the guns fell silent in November 1918. Captain Roy Brown, officially credited with the victory, found himself caught between fame and doubt. While he received accolades from the press and military authorities, he privately expressed uncertainty about whether he had actually fired the fatal shot. The burden of this uncertainty would follow him for the rest of his life. Brown's own account of the engagement was notably modest. In his initial combat report, he described the fight as indecisive, a characterization that was later changed by his commanding officer to decisive when it became clear that Richthofen had been killed. Brown himself never claimed with absolute certainty that his bullets had brought down the Red Baron, acknowledging that the engagement had been too brief and chaotic for him to be completely sure. The Australian soldiers who claimed to have fired the fatal shot were never officially recognised for their achievement. Sergeant Cedric Popkin, who many historians now believe was the actual killer of Richthofen, received no decoration or acknowledgement for what would have been the most significant individual achievement of his military career. The politics of the situation dictated that credit should go to an airman rather than a ground soldier, regardless of what had actually occurred. Modern historical consensus has gradually shifted toward the view that Richthofen was indeed killed by ground fire rather than by Brown's aerial attack. The trajectory of the fatal bullet, the timing of the wound, and the accounts of multiple ground witnesses all support this conclusion. Yet the debate continues, fueled by national pride, conflicting witness accounts, and the simple fact that the truth died with Richthofen in that field near Vaux-sur-Somme. Perhaps the most important aspect of the controversy is not who fired the fatal shot, but what Richthofen's death represented. His final flight embodied all the contradictions and tragedies of the Great War itself. Here was a man of undeniable skill and courage, a professional soldier who'd conducted himself with honor throughout the conflict, brought down not by superior tactics or overwhelming force, but by a single bullet fired in the chaos of a brief, desperate engagement. The circumstances of his death also highlighted the increasingly desperate nature of aerial combat in 1918. The war that had begun with individual pilots taking potshots at each other with pistols had evolved into a technological nightmare where death could come from any direction at any moment. Ground fire, aerial combat, mechanical failure, and simple exhaustion all took their toll on the men who fought in the skies above the Western Front. Richthofen's final flight also demonstrated the fatal consequences of abandoning the tactical principles that had kept him alive for so long. His pursuit of what may violated every rule of aerial combat that he himself had taught to his subordinates. He had allowed himself to be drawn into a low-level chase far behind enemy lines, exactly the kind of situation that he had warned other pilots to avoid. Whether this tactical error was the result of his head wound, the stress of prolonged combat, or simply a momentary lapse in judgment, it cost him his life. The hunter had become the hunted, and the skills that had made him the most feared pilot of the war were insufficient to save him when he found himself in an impossible situation. The death of the Red Baron marked the end of the age of the individual ace as the dominant force in aerial warfare. The combat that claimed Richthofen's life involved multiple aircraft from both sides, ground fire from below, and tactical situations that changed from second to second. It was no longer possible for a single pilot, no matter how skilled, to control the outcome of such engagements through individual excellence alone. This transition reflected broader changes in the nature of warfare itself. The Great War had begun as a conflict dominated by individual courage and traditional military virtues, but it had evolved into an industrial slaughter where technology and mass production counted for more than personal heroism. Aviation had briefly offered a refuge from this reality, a domain where the old values of individual skill and knightly honor could still prevail. Richthofen's death marked the end of that illusion. The weeks following Richthofen's death saw a marked decline in the effectiveness of the German Air Force. Experienced pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced, and new recruits lacked the training and experience necessary to survive in the increasingly lethal skies over the Western Front. The flying circus continued to operate, but it never again achieved the dominance that it had enjoyed under Richthofen's leadership. Part of this decline was due to material factors. Germany was running short of the high-quality materials needed to build aircraft engines, and fuel shortages limited training time for new pilots. But equally important was the loss of the psychological advantage that Richthofen's presence had provided. Allied pilots, who had once gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid combat with the Red Triplane, now flew with renewed confidence. The German High Command attempted to maintain morale by creating new heroes to replace Richthofen, but none of his successors achieved his combination of tactical skill, leadership ability, and personal charisma. Ernst Udet, Werner Voss, and other aces continued to score victories, but they were individuals rather than symbols, deadly but not legendary in the way that Richthofen had become. As the summer of 1918 wore on, it became increasingly clear that Germany had lost the air war. Allied aircraft appeared over German lines with virtual impunity, conducting reconnaissance and ground attack missions that would have been impossible during Richthofen's heyday. The German Air Force, once the terror of the Western Front, had been reduced to a reactive force, capable of occasional local successes, but unable to achieve the air superiority necessary for victory. The final months of the war saw the systematic destruction of German aviation. Allied bombing attacks targeted aircraft factories, training schools, and operational airfields. Experienced pilots were transferred to ground units as the manpower crisis deepened. By the time of the armistice in November 1918, the Luftstreitkräfte existed only as a shadow of its former self. Yet even in defeat, the legacy of Manfred von Richthofen continued to inspire both enemies and allies. His tactical innovations, codified in his memoir and preserved in German military doctrine, influenced the development of fighter tactics that would be employed in conflicts long after his death. The lessons he had learned about leadership, training, and the application of air power would find new relevance in the aerial battles of World War II and beyond. More broadly, Richthofen's career exemplified the transformation of warfare in the early 20th century. He had begun his military service as a cavalry officer in an army that still believed in the decisive charge and the individual hero. He ended it as a master of the most modern form of combat, leading formations of high-tech aircraft in support of mass armies. His life spanned the transition from one era of warfare to another, and his death marked the end of the romantic period of aerial combat. The Red Baron's final flight has been the subject of countless books, films, and documentaries, each attempting to capture the drama and significance of those final moments over the Somme. Yet the true tragedy of April 21st, 1918, was not just the death of a skilled pilot, but the end of an era when individual excellence could still matter in the vast, impersonal machinery of modern warfare. In the immediate aftermath of Richthofen's death, both sides attempted to extract propaganda value from the event. German authorities portrayed him as a martyr who had died for the fatherland, while Allied propagandists emphasized that even Germany's greatest ace could be brought down by superior Allied tactics and equipment. Both narratives contained elements of truth, but neither captured the full complexity of what had occurred. The reality was that Richthofen's death was both inevitable and random, the product of tactical decisions made in seconds that had consequences far beyond what anyone could have imagined. He had been the victim of the same forces that were consuming millions of other young men on battlefields across Europe. The industrial-scale application of violence that characterized the Great War. Yet there was also something uniquely personal about Richthofen's death. Unlike the anonymous soldiers who died in their thousands in the trenches below, he was known to his enemies, respected by them, and mourned by them. The military funeral accorded to his remains reflected a recognition that something valuable had been lost, that the war had claimed not just another casualty, but a remarkable individual whose skills had transcended national boundaries. This respect for a fallen enemy was becoming increasingly rare as the war progressed, and animosity between the combatants deepened. The fact that Allied officers were willing to honor Richthofen with a proper burial spoke to the special nature of aerial combat, where individual skill and courage were still valued even in the midst of total war. The examination of Richthofen's personal effects after his death revealed the human side of the legend. His pockets contained letters from his family, photographs of friends who had been killed earlier in the war, and the small personal items that all soldiers carry as reminders of home. These mundane objects served as a reminder that beneath the fearsome reputation and the propaganda image was simply a young man far from home, fighting in a war that had already claimed too many lives. Perhaps most poignantly, Richthofen's diary entries from his final weeks revealed a man who was increasingly conscious of his own mortality. He wrote frequently about the deaths of friends and comrades, and expressed doubt about his own chances of survival. In one particularly prescient entry, he wrote that he did not expect to live to see the end of the war, a prediction that proved tragically accurate. These diary entries also revealed the toll that continuous combat had taken on his psyche. The confident, almost arrogant young officer of 1916 had been replaced by a more introspective figure who was acutely aware of the random nature of death in aerial combat. He understood that survival was as much a matter of luck as skill, and that his luck could not hold forever. The analysis of Richthofen's final engagement by military historians has yielded important insights into the nature of aerial combat in the Great War. His decision to pursue what may, deep into Allied territory, violated several fundamental principles of fighter tactics, suggesting that even the most experienced pilots could make fatal errors when operating under stress. The engagement also highlighted the increasing importance of ground fire in aerial combat. As aircraft were forced to operate at lower altitudes in support of ground operations, they became increasingly vulnerable to rifle and machine gun fire from below. This development would fundamentally change the nature of tactical aviation, forcing pilots to develop new techniques for surviving in a more dangerous environment. From a technological perspective, Richthofen's death occurred at a time when aircraft design was advancing rapidly. The Fokker Dr. I triplane that he flew on his final mission was already becoming obsolescent, outclassed by newer Allied fighters with better speed and climbing ability. The fact that he continued to fly the triplane was partly a matter of personal preference, but it also reflected the difficulty that German manufacturers were having in keeping pace with Allied aircraft development. The Fokker triplane itself became one of the most recognizable aircraft of the Great War, largely due to its association with Richthofen. Its distinctive three-wing configuration and bright red paint scheme made it instantly identifiable, and it became a symbol of German air power despite its relatively brief service life. The aircraft was actually less effective than many other fighters of the period, but its connection to the Red Baron ensured its place in aviation history. The psychological impact of Richthofen's death extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. For German civilians, already suffering under the effects of the Allied blockade and increasingly pessimistic about the war's outcome, the loss of their greatest military hero was a devastating blow. Richthofen had represented the possibility that individual German excellence could still triumph over superior Allied numbers and resources. His death suggested that this hope was illusory, that Germany's position was indeed hopeless. The propaganda value of his victories had been enormous, providing proof that German pilots were superior to their opponents. His loss therefore had consequences far beyond the tactical realm, contributing to the collapse of civilian morale that would ultimately force Germany to seek an armistice. For Allied forces, Richthofen's death was cause for celebration, but it was tempered by the recognition that they had lost a worthy opponent. Many Allied pilots had developed a grudging respect for the Red Baron, acknowledging his skill and professionalism even while trying to kill him. His death was therefore met with a mixture of relief and regret. Satisfaction at the removal of a dangerous enemy combined with sadness at the loss of a remarkable individual. The immediate tactical impact of Richthofen's death was felt most strongly by the pilots of Jagdgeschwader 1. The Flying Circus had been built around his personality and leadership style, and his loss left a void that no successor could completely fill. Morale plummeted, and the unit's effectiveness declined markedly in the weeks following his death. Part of this decline was due to the practical problems of command succession. Richthofen had been not just a skilled pilot, but an effective administrator and tactician, capable of coordinating the activities of multiple squadrons while maintaining the personal relationships that kept his pilots motivated. Finding a replacement with all of these qualities proved impossible, but the decline also reflected the broader demoralization of the German Air Force as a whole. Richthofen's invincibility had been one of the few remaining sources of confidence for German pilots, a proof that skill and courage could still triumph over superior numbers. His death shattered this illusion and forced German aviators to confront the reality of their deteriorating situation. The weeks following Richthofen's death saw a series of command changes within Jagdgeschwader 1 as the German High Command struggled to find effective leadership for the unit. Wilhelm Reinhard, Richthofen's immediate successor, attempted to maintain the aggressive tactics that had made the Flying Circus famous, but he lacked Richthofen's tactical genius and was killed in a flying accident just 3 months after taking command. Hermann Göring, who assumed command after Reinhard's death, brought a different approach to leading the unit. Less aggressive than his predecessors, Göring emphasized survival over spectacular victories, recognizing that Germany could no longer afford to lose experienced pilots in pursuit of propaganda victories. While this approach was probably more realistic given the circumstances, it marked the end of the Flying Circus as an elite strike force. The investigation into the circumstances of Richthofen's death continued long after the war ended, as historians and aviation enthusiasts attempted to determine exactly what had happened in those crucial seconds over the Somme. The controversy generated numerous books, articles, and documentaries, each presenting different theories about who had fired the fatal shot. The persistence of this debate reflects the enduring fascination with Richthofen's story and the broader mythology that has grown up around the aces of the Great War. In an age of industrial warfare, where individual soldiers were increasingly anonymous, the fighter pilots offered a return to the heroic ideals of an earlier era. Richthofen, as the most successful of these knights of the air, became a symbol of individual excellence triumphing over impossible odds. Yet the circumstances of his death also revealed the limitations of this romantic vision. No amount of individual skill could ultimately overcome the reality of Germany's strategic situation, or the industrial might of the Allied coalition. Richthofen's 80 victories, impressive as they were, could not change the fundamental balance of forces that would determine the war's outcome. The legacy of Richthofen's final flight extends far beyond the immediate circumstances of his death. His tactical innovations and leadership techniques influenced the development of fighter aviation for decades after the Great War ended. The lessons he learned about the importance of altitude, surprise, and coordinated tactics became standard doctrine for air forces around the world. More broadly, his career demonstrated the importance of professional military education and the systematic study of warfare. Richthofen's success was not simply the result of natural talent, but of careful observation, methodical training, and the constant refinement of techniques. This approach to military aviation would prove essential in the even more deadly aerial battles of World War II. The aircraft industry also learned important lessons from Richthofen's career and death. The vulnerability of aircraft to ground fire led to improved armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, while the importance of pilot training resulted in more comprehensive training programs. The technological arms race that characterized aviation during the Great War accelerated after Richthofen's death, as all sides sought to develop aircraft that could survive in an increasingly lethal environment. The cultural impact of Richthofen's story has been equally significant. His red triplane and distinctive appearance made him one of the most recognizable figures of the Great War, and his story has been retold countless times in books, films, and other media. The image of the Red Baron has become synonymous with aerial combat, representing both the romance and the tragedy of war in the air. This cultural legacy has sometimes obscured the historical reality of Richthofen's career. Popular depictions often emphasize the chivalrous aspects of aerial combat, while downplaying its inherent brutality. The reality was that Richthofen was a professional killer, albeit one who operated according to a code of honor that was rapidly becoming obsolete in the modern world. The debate over who killed Richthofen also reflects broader questions about the nature of historical truth and the reliability of eyewitness testimony. The fact that multiple credible witnesses could observe the same event and reach different conclusions about what had occurred highlights the difficulties inherent in reconstructing historical events, particularly those that occurred under conditions of extreme stress and confusion. Modern forensic techniques have added new dimensions to the investigation, but they have not definitively resolved the controversy. The physical evidence is simply too limited and too ambiguous to support a conclusive determination of what happened. In the end, the exact circumstances of Richthofen's death may remain forever uncertain, a fitting mystery for a figure who has achieved legendary status. What is certain is that Richthofen's final flight marked the end of an era in military aviation. The age of the individual ace, when a single pilot could dominate the skies through superior skill and courage, was giving way to an era of mass formations and coordinated tactics. The lessons learned in those final moments over the Somme would shape the development of air power for generations to come. As the sun set on April 21st, 1918, the aviation world had lost one of its greatest practitioners. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, lay dead in a foreign field, his bright red aircraft reduced to scattered fragments by souvenir hunters. The man who had terrorized Allied pilots for nearly 2 years had been brought down by a single bullet fired in the chaos of combat. Yet in death, Richthofen achieved a kind of immortality that had eluded him in life. His story became legend, his tactics became doctrine, and his name became synonymous with excellence in aerial combat. The Red Baron's final flight had ended in tragedy, but it had also created a myth that would inspire and instruct future generations of military aviators. The fields of France, soaked with the blood of millions, had claimed another victim. But this victim was different. Manfred von Richthofen had been more than just another casualty of the Great War. He had been a symbol of human potential, a demonstration that individual excellence could still matter in an age of industrial slaughter. His death marked not just the end of a life, but the end of an era. In the years that followed, as the survivors of the Great War struggled to make sense of what they had experienced, Richthofen's story would be told and retold, each generation finding in it different lessons and meanings. For some, he represented the last knight, a man of honor in a dishonorable war. For others, he embodied the futility of individual heroism in the face of industrial warfare. But perhaps the most important lesson of Richthofen's final flight was simpler and more universal. It demonstrated that even the most skilled, the most prepared, and the most successful could fall victim to the random violence of war. In the end, the Red Baron was mortal, just like the thousands of anonymous soldiers who died around him. His extraordinary skills had allowed him to cheat death for longer than most, but they could not cheat it forever. The red triplane that had been the terror of the Western Front lay broken in a French field, its bright paint fading in the afternoon sun. Its pilot, the most feared ace of the Great War, was dead at 25, his promise unfulfilled and his potential unrealized. The final flight of the Red Baron was over, and with it ended one of the most remarkable careers in the history of military aviation. As night fell over the battlefield, the guns continued their endless thunder, and the war ground on toward its inevitable conclusion. But in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed his final moments, Manfred von Richthofen had already begun his transformation from man to legend. The Red Baron was dead, but his story would live forever, a reminder of what was possible when skill, courage, and determination came together in pursuit of excellence. Even in the midst of humanity's darkest hour, the controversy surrounding his death would continue for decades, with historians and aviation enthusiasts debating every detail of that final engagement. But perhaps the exact circumstances matter less than what they represented. The end of an era when individual heroism could still shine through the darkness of industrial warfare, and the beginning of a new age when technology and mass production would determine the outcome of battles. Manfred von Richthofen's final flight had lasted only minutes, but its impact would be felt for generations. In those brief moments over the Somme, the age of the flying ace reached its climax and began its decline. The Red Baron was dead, the Knight of the Air had fallen, and the world would never be quite the same. Thank you for watching this tale of courage, controversy, and the ultimate price of war. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe for more in-depth explorations of history's greatest military conflicts. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful, and may you rest well knowing the stories of those who came before us.